You think medieval people were saints wrapped in chastity and purity, spending their lives praying and choking down desire? Wrong. Rip that fantasy to shreds, because the truth is filthier than your stomach can handle. Their world was not soft hymns and folded hands. It was dripping lust, twisted games, and a madness of flesh that makes your cheap dating apps look like holy scripture. Their bedrooms were not chambers of prayer, but theaters of corruption, freak shows of desire so wild and vile they make 50 Shades of Grey look like a bedtime tale told to children. They devoured feasts of lust, gorging on animal balls as if swallowing testicles would fuel their own depravity. They dragged men into courtrooms and forced them to prove, in front of cold-eyed judges, that their cocks were broken and useless. Public impotence trials where shame was the entertainment. This was not purity, not light, not holy devotion. This was the Dark Ages, and the darkness was not absence of sex. It was the filth of what they did with it. The bundling bed, one of the most absurd, humiliating, and downright cursed excuses for courtship that human history ever spat out. Bundling. Picture this nightmare. You're a young man in the medieval cesspit, and your parents have decided your fate. They've found you a potential spouse. Great, right? You imagine a tender evening, maybe conversation, maybe something that even hints at romance. Wrong. Throw that fantasy into the dung heap. What you get instead is this: being stuffed into a sack like livestock, tied up tight, and hurled into bed with a complete stranger. That was bundling. It was sold as the medieval version of a wholesome supervised sleepover, except there was nothing wholesome about it, nothing romantic, just awkward humiliation dripping with hypocrisy and a danger no one wanted to admit. Here's the scene. Young couples bound together in a bed, fully clothed, wrapped so tight it felt more like burial shrouds than garments of love. Sometimes, to hammer the point of absurdity home, they shoved a slab of wood between the bodies, a plank to split flesh from flesh, a coffin lid of chastity separating two breathing souls. Nothing screams romance like lying stiff and sweating, side by side, your heat radiating through the fabric while a piece of lumber mocks you, daring you not to touch. But here is where it turns insane, where it leaves the territory of stupid tradition and steps straight into grotesque hypocrisy. It wasn't just allowed by parents, it was encouraged. Families practically advertised it. They invited suitors into their homes, beckoning them into the beds of their daughters, binding them together in cloth, in boards, in silence, pretending that this freak show was safety. In their blind logic, this was the way to let young people get to know each other. Imagine that. Medieval parents gazing at the idea of chaperone dating and muttering, "No, this isn't enough. Let's add sacks, boards, ropes, and forced shared body heat." The sheer idiocy is staggering, and it didn't stop there. It became an industry. Yes, an industry of fear and lust denial. Special bundling bags were crafted, stitched carefully for the very purpose of keeping men and women wrapped together, close enough to taste each other's breath, but supposedly safe from sin. Imagine that. The medieval world producing merchandise, manufacturing fabric prisons, all to stop two people from touching, even as they shoved them under the same blanket. That's how deep the sickness ran. They created a market around their contradictions, a business in cloth cages of hypocrisy. But here's the dagger twist. Bundling didn't work. Of course it didn't. It was doomed to fail from the start. Historical records, dusty and damning, reveal the outcome. Pregnancy rates among bundled couples weren't lower. They were higher. Yes, higher. Turns out, when you shove two hormone-driven bodies into a bed, no amount of boards or ropes or sacks can stop nature from clawing its way through. The inevitable happened again and again and again, but still they clung to the practice. Blind fools convinced their wooden planks could hold back biology. Who could have possibly guessed the obvious? Everyone except them. And the cherry on this grotesque feast of hypocrisy, the priests, the moral guardians, the religious watchmen of the day never stopped screaming about it. They condemned it from their pulpits, shouting that bundling was immoral, dangerous, a rotten road to sin. They hissed their warnings, wagged their fingers, demanded an end. And yet, pathetic as it sounds, they couldn't stop it. They had no power against the rot of culture. Bundling was too ingrained, too normal, too soaked into the daily life of villages. The people shrugged at the priests' sermons and kept stuffing their sons and daughters into sacks. The priests fumed. The parents pretended it was safe. The couples kept on sweating in the same bed. It was the medieval version of trying to ban social media. Technically possible, practically impossible, a laughable crusade. The hypocrisy roared on, fueled by denial, driven by lust, wrapped in cloth, and nailed down with wood. Bundling was not romance. Bundling was a coffin dressed as courtship. It was hypocrisy sewn into fabric, nailed into boards, and shoved into bedrooms. It was parents feeding their children to temptation while pretending they were protecting them. It was priests shouting into the void, powerless. It was an entire culture pretending it had invented chastity while its daughters swelled with unwanted pregnancies. That was the truth of bundling, the comedy of restraint that rotted into tragedy. Aphrodisiac feasts. If you thought food is love was some harmless modern cliche, the medieval world will ram it down your throat until you gag. They took that phrase, strangled it, and dragged it into filth. Because in their twisted banquet halls, food wasn't love. It was lust, naked and howling, and not strawberries or chocolate, no soft sweetness. No, they crafted elaborate feasts from horrors that would make you call the health department, make you vomit before dessert. These were meals designed not to nourish, but to ignite lust, obscene feasts built to force flesh into heat. The centerpiece? Animal testicles, always the testicles. The prized stones of young bulls, rams, and boars. These were no mere cuts of meat. They were holy relics of filth, worshipped as the supreme fuel for desire. They called them stones, dressing up their sickness in polite language, too cowardly to say balls, yet eager to devour them. Cookbooks dripped with recipes, every page a hymn to lust. Roasted, boiled, fried, ground into powders, mixed into wine. If there was a way to mutilate a pair of testicles and shove them into a dish, the medieval chef had done it. And they didn't stop there. Sparrow brains. Yes, you heard it right. Tiny birds butchered, skulls cracked open, their brains spooned out and served as delicacies to enhance performance. The belief that swallowing the life of these fragile creatures would somehow grant power between the sheets. They feasted on reproductive organs of all kinds, snatching fertility from beasts, swallowing it whole, thinking that eating life would create life. Sympathetic magic, they called it, a mockery of nature, where lust was not courted but devoured. Every bite a ritual, every dish a grotesque act of sympathetic cannibalism, with organ meat piled high on silver plates. And behind all of this grotesque feasting, there was the spice trade. Don't picture exotic flavors drifting across the Silk Road as noble traders exchange goods. No, picture lust, the trade in pepper, ginger, cinnamon, saffron. It was not only about taste. These were powders of desire, sold as edible sin. They were worth their weight in gold, not because they flavored soups, but because they were whispered to make men hard and women wet. Spices were their medieval Viagra, smuggled and hoarded, crushed into feasts of hunger. Nobles, those bloated pigs, hosted grand love feasts, obscene banquets where every single dish was engineered to stir lust, to summon flesh into fire. But here is where it sinks deeper into madness. These weren't just any feasts. They were served at wedding receptions. Imagine the scene. A bride and groom, freshly chained in holy matrimony, sitting before a grotesque parade of dishes, roasted bull testicles, sparrow brains and sauces, animal genitals boiled and arranged as if they were delicacies from heaven. The guests clapping, toasting, watching the couple chew through meals designed not for taste but for sex. Every dish was a command. Breed, lust, perform. Even the wedding cake itself was not sacred sweetness, but another instrument of desire. Pine nuts, almonds, honey. Not for flavor, no, but because each was believed to rattle the loins and fuel lust. Imagine that. Your celebration of love transformed into a grotesque fertility ritual, where every bite was a demand to prove yourself in bed. And it wasn't just superstition muttered in whispers. Medieval physicians, the so-called scholars of health, wrote treatises on this filth. Detailed instructions, recipes, medical texts with names that reek of obsession. On the generation of semen, foods that increase lust. These weren't hidden scrolls passed under the table. They were studied openly in universities, pored over by men of learning. Imagine entire manuscripts serving as medieval sex cookbooks, carefully written, studied, and taught as if they were sacred science. Scholars in robes, pens scratching over parchment, documenting the best way to boil a testicle or stew a brain to maximize lust. The obsession sank so deep into the marrow of culture that even the church had to claw against it. Ingredients were banned during fasting, not because they were unhealthy, but because they were too sexual, too arousing. Imagine that. Priests, terrified of spices, terrified of nuts, terrified of saffron, declaring them forbidden not to save bodies, but to cage desire. Even God, it seemed, had to compete with medieval lust feasts. They lived in a world where dinner could damn you, where spice itself was treated like a demon whispering into flesh. This was medieval love, medieval courtship, medieval romance. Not flowers, not poems, not purity. It was balls boiled in wine. It was brains spooned from birds. It was cakes mixed with honey, not for sweetness, but for sex. It was nobles drooling over aphrodisiac menus, priests tearing their hair, scholars writing treatises that were little more than lust disguised as medicine. Food as love? Number? Food as madness? Food as filth? Food as lust dragged onto the table? Butchered, spiced, roasted, swallowed. That was their truth, their horror, their feast, the consummation circus. You think it's awkward when your parents meet the person you're with? That's nothing. Imagine instead a room full of nobles, priests, lords, family, strangers, all crammed around your bed staring while you're forced to lose your virginity. Welcome to the medieval bedding ceremony, a nightmare where privacy wasn't just discouraged. It was outlawed. For the aristocracy, consummation wasn't a private act of love. It was a legal obligation, a contract sealed with flesh, a ritual humiliation staged for the eyes of others. Marriage meant nothing, absolutely nothing, until the act was performed in front of witnesses. Why? Because in their twisted logic, property, land, and political power couldn't hinge on faith or trust. They had to hinge on bodies colliding. And marriage was not valid unless penetration was confirmed. And so, like pigs paraded to slaughter, couples were marched to their chambers and forced to perform. Nothing says legally binding contract like your wedding guests crowding around your bed to watch you screw. The process was theater, grotesque, and ceremonial. After the vows, the bride and groom were not left in peace but escorted, paraded through a procession of guests, as though their humiliation was the final entertainment of the night. The bride stripped by her female relatives, hands clawing away her garments while whispering advice, judgment, mockery. The groom stripped by his male kin, a gender-segregated strip show where shame was dressed up as tradition. Then the main event. The newlyweds placed in bed, stripped bare of dignity, as nobles, priests, family, and court officials gathered close, staring, waiting. These witnesses weren't sneaking peeks. They stood there the entire time. They didn't leave once the act began. They stayed. They stared. Some even had the gall to offer advice, encouragement, jeers, as though the most intimate act of human life were nothing more than a public performance, a disgusting farce. But it sinks lower still. When the deed was done, or thought to be done, the witnesses didn't just shuffle away. No, sometimes they demanded proof. Sheets ripped from the bed, held up, examined like evidence in a trial. They searched for blood, proof that the bride's virginity had been shattered, proof that penetration had truly occurred. Imagine it. You are forced to hand your bed sheets to a committee of onlookers, as though submitting paperwork, except this paperwork drips with your humiliation. And it wasn't just symbolic. It was law. The bedsheets themselves were treated as legal evidence, capable of deciding whether the marriage was valid or void. This wasn't love. This wasn't faith. This was a courtroom staged in a bedroom, with your body as the testimony. And don't think it was reserved for kings and queens. Oh no, this circus infected countless marriages across medieval Europe. Any union involving land, property, or politics, any marriage with weight, could demand witness consummation. Thousands of couples dragged into this performance. Thousands of intimate moments turned into public trials. And yes, some couples tried to trick the system, tried to close the doors, tried to keep their dignity. They begged witnesses to wait outside, to listen instead of watch. But even that was often rejected. The court records scream with cases where marriages were annulled because consummation wasn't properly witnessed, which meant the nightmare had to be done again, this time with eyes in the room, with no escape. Again and again, until the law was satisfied, until every shred of privacy was stripped away. This wasn't some underground filth whispered in shadows. No, this humiliation was polished, ritualized, normalized. Medieval etiquette books, the manuals of high society, carved rules for it. They contained written instructions for bedding ceremonies, dictating exactly how witnesses should behave, how close they should stand, what words they should speak, how long they should watch. There were rules for the couple, rules for the audience, a twisted handbook for forced voyeurism. In this world, voyeurism wasn't sin, it wasn't shame, it was duty, a formalized spectacle, an institution carved into stone. The consummation of marriage was no act of love. It was a circus of flesh, a theater of humiliation, a grotesque ritual where every noble and priest turned into a voyeur by law. This was medieval marriage at its core, not two lovers joining, but two bodies forced into performance, an audience demanding proof, a system where intimacy was stripped bare, turned into contract, turned into evidence, turned into circus. Sacred breeding schedules. Medieval aristocrats didn't simply crawl into bed when lust struck them. No, these lunatics scheduled sex like it was a corporate board meeting, complete with priests, astrologers, and medical frauds hovering over their sheets. Nothing about intimacy was natural. It was planned, charted, mapped out like a campaign of war. Getting pregnant in their world required more preparation than a crusade, more calculation than a siege, more detail than a NASA mission centuries before NASA even existed. These people lived in obsession. The stars had to be checked, the planets aligned, the humors balanced, the saints consulted, because in their twisted minds, the heavens themselves gave a damn about whether they produced heirs. They clung to their astrological charts like sacred scripture. Couples weren't free to touch unless the planets gave permission. The waxing moon, they said, was best. The woman's body needed to be in a hot humoral balance, her fluids properly aligned, her womb made ready like some infernal machine. Medical texts droned on with detail, advising on planets, moons, and even feast days of saints. Yes, some believed that a child conceived on a saint's holy day would be blessed, born carrying divine favor. Imagine that horror. Your bedroom dictated not by love or desire, but by a calendar marked with feast days, moon cycles, and planetary charts. Imagine needing to consult 3 different calendars just to know if you were allowed to try for a baby. And this madness didn't stop with days. It sank into hours, weather, and even geography. Physicians wrote manuals instructing couples on the proper time of day. Midnight, they said, the witching hour of conception. The weather had to be warm and humid, as if children were crops to be planted in summer soil. Even the bed itself had rules. It had to face east, toward the rising sun, as if turning your bed like a compass needle could summon a child from the womb. Sex was no act of love. It was a logistical nightmare, a ritual drowned in superstition. What should have been natural became torture, stripped of spontaneity and caged in endless rules. And then came gender selection, a carnival of anatomical stupidity. To conceive a boy, the man was told to tie off his left testicle. Yes, tie it off, as though strangling one side of his anatomy would somehow shift the seed, because they believed boys came from the right testicle and girls from the left. The ignorance is staggering, but worse is the cruelty, forcing couples into rituals that made no sense, humiliating them with false science, demanding obedience to idiocy. And yet they believed it, clung to it, obeyed it. This was medicine poisoned with superstition, tearing the dignity out of conception. Religion twisted the knife even deeper. The church declared endless days when sex was forbidden. No intimacy on Sundays, none on Wednesdays or Fridays, none during Lent, during Advent, during menstruation, during pregnancy while breastfeeding, and on roughly 183 other days in the year. Half the year or more was carved away by prohibitions, leaving couples to stumble through a minefield of guilt and fear. Every attempt to make love risked damnation, unless it was scheduled like a holy ritual, squeezed into the tiny gaps the church allowed. Sin crouched at every corner, whispering shame into every act. Wealthy families, desperate for heirs, sank even deeper into this filth. They hired specialists, half priest, half doctor, half astrologer, men who sold themselves as fertility consultants. These charlatans drew up personalized schedules of conception, analyzing birth charts, bodily fluids, religious restrictions, and planetary signs as though they could dictate life with quills and ink. They were the medieval version of fertility apps, except instead of science, They offered superstition wrapped in arrogance. Nobles paid fortunes for these schedules, terrified that without them their bloodlines would wither. The pressure was monstrous. Couples felt their entire future riding not on love or chance, but on superstition etched into parchment. And some went further still. The obsession was so deep that couples traveled hundreds of miles just to be in the right location at the right time. Geography itself became another prison. They believed the land, the soil, the very air could determine the success of conception. Imagine the desperation, dragging themselves across dangerous roads, braving bandits and plague, all so that their rutting could take place under the correct sky. Sex was turned into pilgrimage, conception into madness. This was the medieval world, where breeding wasn't sacred love but sacred scheduling, where lust was chained by charts, crushed by rules, smothered by priests, and dictated by stars, where men tied off their own testicles in the name of gender, where couples obeyed calendars like slaves, where heirs were born not of passion but of fear, not of love but of superstition. The bed was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield of ignorance. The girdle of Venus. In the diseased theater of the medieval world, even underwear was dragged into the pit of superstition, twisted into relics of lust and desperation. They turned undergarments into holy artifacts, and the result was every bit as grotesque and pathetic as you'd expect. In their madness, they believed a strip of cloth could dictate whether you bred heirs or died barren. Dressing yourself wasn't simple. It was a ritual of fear, requiring the approval of priests and the mutterings of physicians before flesh was even covered. The so-called girdle of Venus wasn't poetry. It was real, an actual belt tied around waist or hips, woven from silk or linen, covered in scratches of religious prayers, astrological symbols, or magic spells. To the medieval mind, this belt wasn't cloth. It was power, fertility guaranteed, childbirth made safe, lust magnified, all strapped around the body like a holy leash. But the belt was only the opening act in this freak show of sexual accessories. Women strapped themselves with amulets, little pouches of filth stuffed with powders, bones, and lies. Powdered unicorn horn, they claimed, though really it was narwhal tusk stolen from the seas. Ground gemstones crushed into dust and swallowed or worn against the body, because they believed swallowing rock and wearing jewels could coax life from the womb. Some amulets carried written prayers, biblical verses, pathetic scraps of parchment, because apparently God needed reminders tied to a woman's waist to know what she wanted. They begged their gods with ink and cloth, as though heaven was deaf unless bribed by talismans. And then came the most grotesque trinket of all, the conception stone, a small rock, sometimes crystal, shoved into undergarments during sex. They believed this lump of stone, nestled against sweating flesh, would spark conception. Different stones for different results. Emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, diamonds for twins. These fools thought they could sculpt genetics with pebbles, dictate creation with jewelry. Picture it, women grinding rocks against their bodies during intercourse, whispering that the stone would decide the future of their womb. This was not faith. This was madness dressed as ritual. Men weren't spared from the lunacy. They too were dragged into the cult of magical underwear. They paraded their own accessories, rings worn on specific fingers, as if metal bands could steer fertility. Amulets stuffed with animal parts, always testicles, because medieval people were rabidly obsessed with testicles, worshipping them as if all power began and ended in those dangling organs. Blessed loincloths were stitched and worn, cloths prayed over by priests, promised to turn limp flesh into divine instruments. It was a circus of lust dressed in fabric, priests selling blessings for gold while men clung to scraps of cloth like sacred relics. And yes, the church sank its teeth into the business. Priests blessed belts, blessed amulets, blessed bed sheets, charging fees for every muttered prayer. Sex itself became a subscription service. Every act of intimacy taxed, blessed, controlled by holy men eager to bleed the desperate. Medieval couples didn't make love, they paid for it. They prayed for it. They dressed for it with magical cloth and jeweled rocks, their beds littered with trinkets, their shame fed to priests who pocketed their coins. Some of these fertility trinkets were so elaborate that they needed instruction manuals. Yes, manuals for underwear. Surviving texts describe how to wear the belts, what prayers to mutter as they were tied, and what to do when the charms inevitably failed. It was customer service for magical lingerie, step-by-step guides for desperate bodies. Failure was always blamed on the wearer, never on the fraud itself. And the wealthy, as always, turned the madness into spectacle. The finest belts were crafted from silk dragged across continents from China, sewn with gold thread, studded with gemstones, luxury items of superstition. Poor women, rotting in their poverty, stitched their own versions from rags and scraps, creating a class system where even magical underwear became a measure of worth. The faith in these relics was unbreakable. Some women refused to let men touch them unless their belts were fastened, unless their amulets were strapped against their flesh, unless their stones were in place. Some men refused to bed women who weren't properly accessorized, demanding proof of charms before lust. In this nightmare world, getting dressed wasn't just vanity, it was requirement, a prerequisite for rutting. Sex was chained to cloth, chained to rocks, chained to spells muttered over silk. It was no longer natural, no longer free. It was shackled by superstition, bound by belts, corrupted by priests. Medieval people turned their very underwear into cages of faith and lust, and then bowed before them as though salvation itself hung from a girdle. Public impotence trials. You think modern divorce is humiliating? You think walking into court and airing out dirty secrets is bad? That's nothing. Imagine standing before a panel of judges, physicians, priests, and a crowd of gawking strangers, forced to prove whether your body can function in bed. That was the medieval nightmare. Privacy was slaughtered, dignity strangled, and humiliation paraded in full view. Impotence trials were not just legal proceedings, they were public executions of pride. In a world where the church locked marriage like a prison, claiming your husband was impotent was one of the few escape routes for a desperate woman. But escape came at a cost: proof. And proof meant dragging your sex life into the cold hands of law. The process was grotesque, a legal carnival of flesh. First, the couple was split apart and examined like livestock. Medical experts prodded and stared, inspecting genitals for deformities or failures, as though they could read the truth of desire in flesh. Then came the interrogation. Sworn oaths, endless questions, demanded details. How often did you try? How exactly did it fail? What happened under the sheets? Their answers scribbled down, dissected, judged. But the true horror came with the so-called trial by Congress. Yes, that's what they called it. If poking and questioning weren't enough, the court ordered the couple to perform under supervision. Sex on command, sex under law. Special rooms in courthouses or rented chambers became theaters of shame. Officials crouched behind screens, peered through peepholes, watching, waiting. The couple was given time, ordered to perform like beasts in captivity. If the man failed, if his body betrayed him, the marriage was stripped away, annulled, his dignity shredded. Some men, desperate and terrified, tried to cheat. They smuggled herbs, animal parts, magical concoctions, medieval Viagra. They swallowed powders, rubbed strange ointments, carried charms into the chamber. But the court was relentless. Records show men caught sneaking aphrodisiacs into the room, dragged out, stripped further, examined like criminals to ensure no artificial help was being used. Humiliation layered on humiliation, their shame magnified, and the nightmare dragged on. These trials weren't quick. They stretched for months, years even. Multiple attempts required, dozens of sessions ordered. Couples forced to rut under law again and again. Their private misery turned into public entertainment because the judges, in their infinite cruelty, believed people deserved endless chances to prove themselves sexually competent, and women weren't spared from the degradation. If a woman accused her husband, she too became spectacle. She had to prove her own desire, her own capacity, her willingness. Physicians examined her, questioned her, demanded to know her arousal, her responses, her body's secrets. The logic was venomous. If the man failed, perhaps it was her fault. Perhaps she wasn't pretty enough, wasn't eager enough, didn't inspire lust. Victim became accused, and her dignity gutted in the same courtroom circus. The social destruction was complete. Win or lose, once dragged through this hell, your name became filth in the mouths of neighbors. Gossip spread like plague. Men branded impotent, women branded liars, both mocked and ridiculed. Some men, choking on pride, chose annulment outright, preferring to admit impotence on paper rather than suffer the torment of public testing. Because the trial was worse than the sentence. The court didn't just judge, They stripped flesh, pride, and dignity until nothing was left but shame. Brothel business empire. Here's a fact that will split your skull wide open. The medieval church, the so-called keepers of purity and holiness, weren't just tolerating prostitution, they were the pimps of Europe, the architects of the largest sex trafficking empire of their time. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't a whispered scandal. It was reality. An institution that thundered sermons about chastity and sin was raking in coin from the world's oldest profession. By the 12th century in London, in the district known as the Borough of Southwark, there were 18 licensed brothels, packed with over 1,000 prostitutes. And who held the keys? Who lined their pockets from the flesh of women? The Bishop of Winchester himself. The so-called shepherd of souls was the brothel master running his holy empire on the broken bodies of the desperate. And the hypocrisy was as brazen as it was putrid. This wasn't some shady secret business. Church leaders openly declared prostitution a necessary evil, claiming it prevented worse sins, rape, adultery, homosexuality. They dressed their filth in logic, saying the brothels kept society stable. But underneath the mask of piety, it was greed and lust. They regulated it, managed it, profited from it, the same way governments tax vice today. Only here it was not bureaucrats, it was men of God, men sworn to purity, now running an industry of flesh. The genius of their hypocrisy lay in the loophole. They couldn't condone prostitution outright, but canon law had no objection to collecting rent. So they washed their hands, let others run the brothels, and collected coin like holy landlords. And those brothels weren't free havens of choice. They were prisons under strict rules. Women forced to wear special clothing so the world knew their shame, forced to work certain hours, chained to designated streets, trapped in marked-out neighborhoods where their existence was both visible and despised. They couldn't refuse customers unless they had just cause. They couldn't stop on holy days unless the church said so. They were herded like cattle, submitted to regular medical examinations, their bodies picked over to make sure they remained profitable. It was order enforced by chains, dressed in rules, strangling their humanity. The money trail was its own form of damnation. Prostitutes paid rent to brothel keepers. Brothel keepers paid rent to property owners. Property owners paid taxes to the church. It was a pyramid built on suffering, with the powerless on the bottom and bishops perched at the top like bloated spiders. In the most obscene detail of all, the profits, the gold pulled from the sweat and misery of women, didn't just pad pockets. That sin money funded the church itself. It built churches, gilded monasteries, paid for religious festivals. Cathedrals rose from the profits of prostitution. Bells tolled in towers bought by the bodies of the exploited. People literally purchased salvation with money drenched in sin. And when reformers tried to smash this machine of corruption, they found resistance everywhere. Religious leaders, secular authorities, every parasite who fed off the brothel system fought to keep it alive. Too much coin was flowing. Too many hands were greased. Morality was drowned beneath profit. The hypocrisy lasted for centuries, festering in plain sight, until Protestant reformers and shifting social winds finally dragged the truth into the open. By then, the rot was undeniable. But for hundreds of years, the church, the so-called mouthpiece of God on earth, was nothing more than a pimp in robes. They didn't just tolerate sin, they industrialized it. They transformed prostitution into a holy business empire, a sex trafficking operation so vast and shameless that even modern organized crime would gnash its teeth in envy. Medieval contraception madness. The so-called birth control of the Dark Ages was not science, not medicine, not even reason. It was lunacy dressed as wisdom, grotesque rituals of poison and filth that make modern contraception look like divine miracles. Their methods were not just useless, they were dangerous, humiliating, and often lethal. And at the rotten core of nearly every method lay the medieval obsession with animal genitals. Testicles again, always testicles. Women were told to wear pouches stuffed with weasel testicles around their necks, dangling like cursed jewelry, believing this talisman would ward off conception. Why? Because weasels were considered promiscuous yet had small litters. So in the diseased logic of the time, wearing their organs would somehow pass that controlled fertility to humans. This wasn't medicine, it was superstition rotting the mind. But the testicle charms were only the beginning of the nightmare. The rest came in the form of potions so vile they turned women into walking corpses. Concoctions brewed from ground-up beaver testicles mixed with wine, powdered iron stirred into water, and the most grotesque of all, doses of mercury, the poisonous metal, swallowed in desperation. These poisons shredded bodies from the inside, maiming or killing those who drank them. Some women died, and in a sick, bitter irony, the method worked, because dead women can't get pregnant. That was medieval contraception in practice. Success through destruction. And then came the sneezing. Yes, sneezing. Medieval physicians, in their cavern of stupidity, believed that if a woman sneezed immediately after sex, the violent force would eject the man's seed before it could take hold. Women carried pepper or irritants in their pockets, ready to shove up their noses after intercourse, hacking and sneezing in a pitiful attempt to expel life. It was absurd theater, humiliating and useless, yet prescribed with absolute seriousness by the physicians of the age. Physical barriers were no less insane. Honey-soaked wool stuffed into vaginas, imagined to trap or poison sperm. Crocodile dung of all things inserted before intercourse, as if rotting filth was the key to purity. Women mutilated themselves with these concoctions, shoving discomfort and disease into their own bodies for a lie. The half-lemon method was perhaps the least idiotic. A slice pressed against the cervix like a cap. The acid in the fruit may have done something, but the agony, the burning sting, and the sheer desperation it represented made the act grotesque. They turned fruit into weapons against their own flesh. The timing method was another cruel joke. Medieval doctors declared with confidence that women were most fertile during menstruation and least fertile in mid-cycle. They got it completely backwards. Couples desperate to avoid children were instructed to have sex at precisely the worst time, guaranteeing conception while convinced they were preventing it. It was a system of lies, a calendar of guaranteed failure, and of course the madness of magic. Contraception wasn't just in pouches and potions, it lived in spells, stones, and rituals. Women clutched amulets stuffed with charms, walked backwards around churches, muttered scripted prayers, buried objects beneath full moons. They set herbs aflame, scattered powders, performed absurd ceremonies, convinced God himself needed detailed instructions before deciding whether to grant them infertility. Their wombs became battlefields of superstition, their lives chained to rituals that mocked both faith and reason. Even the one method that held truth, the withdrawal method, was poisoned by medieval ignorance. Doctors warned that pulling out could kill men. Madness, blindness, even death, they swore, would come from incomplete ejaculation. They spread terror around the only effective method they stumbled upon, convincing men that preserving their seed would rot their minds and poison their bodies. So even the rare sliver of practicality was crushed under fear. This was contraception in the medieval world. Testicles on strings, poisons in the gut, dung in the body, pepper up the nose, and prayers muttered to deaf heavens. Every method reeked of desperation and ignorance, each one a monument to how far humanity can fall when superstition replaces reason. It wasn't control, it was torment. It wasn't prevention, it was punishment. They didn't conquer fertility, they poisoned themselves, humiliated themselves, and called it medicine. The medieval sexual paradox was madness incarnate. They were a society frothing with lust yet strangled by hypocrisy, sexually insane from top to bottom. Young couples were shoved into beds with wooden boards jammed between their bodies, a farce of chastity played out under parental approval. At the same time, the church, the holy voice of purity, ran sprawling prostitution empires, profiting from sin while spitting sermons about virtue. The entire medieval approach to sex was a disease mirror reflecting the rot of human nature. Desperation drove them, and in desperation they swallowed every lie, clung to every ritual, no matter how absurd or degrading. They tied magical underwear around their waists, stuffed themselves with charms, and muttered prayers over cloth and stones. They swallowed animal brains, gnawed on testicles, believing these grotesque meals would light fire in their loins. They let priests and judges watch them rut in the name of legality, their most intimate acts transformed into public theater. It all proves one brutal truth. When people are desperate enough, they will believe anything, try anything, and debase themselves to any depth, calling it wisdom while drowning in filth.